Okay, welcome to Deadline TV. Today's guest is Tom O'Connor, a retired FBI agent who spent 23 years in the Washington field office and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, investigating. His specialty was investigating extremist groups, uh, and Tom is also now running a consulting company called Fed Squared Consulting, and they train government and private companies in training about counterterrorism and extremist groups. Welcome, Tom. Thanks for
Well,
thanks for doing
thank you
this.
very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So let me ask you right off the bat. We're seeing. I mean, this is just a crazy time we're in right now.
It really is.
Uh,
Yeah.
we're seeing guns show up at the Capitol here in Michigan. Uh, Either people bringing their guns to show that they had the right to carry AK-47s or whatever the assault
Sure.
rifles were. We're seeing the 17-year-old kid in Kenosha, Wisconsin, show up with assault rifles. What's changed from just a few years ago, or has anything changed? Has it really just
Well,
come out more?
I think if you look back through history, and I think that one of the presentations I've been giving is calling it the changing face of hate. And there's a lot of things that have changed, but primarily the background and ideologies in a lot of ways have stayed the same. So the idea of having long weapons at rallies or protests is not something that's brand new, and it may be more prevalent right now because we're seeing a lot of it.
Mhm.
But you also, if you think back to the militia movement in the 1990s,
Mhm.
there were events that took place in militias around the country. The people felt that the government was overstepping their bounds. Events like Waco, Ruby Ridge, things like this, where people felt that their government was stepping outside the bounds where they should be, and
Mhm.
they also felt like the government was going to be coming for their weapons, right? And then you throw in the conspiracy theories of the New World Order, and that there's going to be a takeover of government, and people will be put into concentration camps around the United States, and people really believed this, that were in
Mhm.
that movement.
Mhm.
You saw weapons showing up at those types of events on the right wing side. On the left wing side, when you look at the new Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there were also weapons brought to those events from the left side. So it isn't something that's brand new.
Mhm.
But now the interesting thing is that we're starting to see at events groups that are bringing weapons that have different ideological backgrounds, and they're not all straight up left and right,
Mhm.
as you would think. There's groups such as the Boogaloo Boys, who
Wow.
in Virginia showed up to a Second Amendment protest. They feel like their guns are going to be taken away from them, and
Mhm.
they show up at these events. And they also started showing up at events where people were protesting what they believed was the overreach of the government for COVID-19 restrictions.
Right. We
Um,
see that in Michigan. I don't know how much you've followed it here in Michigan, but we had at least two instances during early on this year where we had a lot of people showing up with long rifles and assault rifles, and sort of being encouraged by the president, who was attacking the governor more. What do you make of the groups in like Michigan who are showing up for
well,
that?
I think I mean, you can go nationally and look at it. It's not specific to one region of the country. You're seeing people that feel, and the strange part is in the 90s when the militias were really forming. You saw very, very strong anti-government. They were not supportive of the government. They felt
Mhm.
the government was coming after them. And now you're seeing militias formed, or longer standing ones, that
Mhm.
are supporting the government and that are showing up in locations to protect the citizens from the what they believe is the onslaught of the left or socialism, communism. Uh, so it is a very different dichotomy when you talk about what the background is on some of these militias, because like the Boogaloo Boys, again, they're a form of a militia,
Hmm.
but they're also very deconstructed. They do not like the government, and they really do not like police. So they're, if you take that background, you would put them more on the anarchist Antifa side of the coin, but
Uh,
reality they also fall onto the right. So it's very interesting. It's not as cut and dried as it may have been back in the 90s, where
okay.
the extremes actually have more in common than they may not have had in the past, right?
I was in 1995. I was working at the Detroit News, and we started covering the Oklahoma bombing. A good part of it from Michigan,
Right.
where in the thumb of Michigan, the Nichols brothers and Tim McVeigh, they were hanging out at a bar, and they were hanging out at a little town called Decker, Michigan,
Yeah.
and we suddenly saw this, and it was probably there, but we just suddenly noticed all the militia was popping up. And so one of the questions I have is that you were talking about sort of the origin. When you were doing your work over the years, did Michigan come up as sort of a significant player in terms of these militias, or was it just another state with
Well, I
militias?
think you got to give Michigan some credit in that when it came to the organization of militias, they were kind of ahead of the game, right? And it may be the feeling of, these organizations or movements are usually formed when there is a downturn in the economy, people
Mhm.
lose their jobs. So that's where they're not supported by the government. They feel in any of these extremist groups or ideologies, the person
Mhm.
feels like they've been victimized. So
Right.
you get a group of people who are out of work, having difficulty. They have to blame someone. So commonly, it's the government that's blamed. So
Hmm.
in the 90s, when the economy was taking a real hit, Michigan would be a center point for a lot of that due to the car industry and all the different industrial parts of the country
Hmm.
or the state that were having, may have felt the economy hits a little bit
Right.
stronger. So I think you're probably right in that it was more of a focal point for the beginnings of that back in the 90s. And once again, it is likely that with now we have like a trifecta. It's the perfect storm. You have the economy, you have polarization of the political views in the United States, where there is very very little in the middle anymore. And
Hmm.
so when you have people pulling to their corners, left and right, you're going to have more people at those extremes, and that means that there's going to be more people that potentially could step outside of even that extreme to violence, because
Yeah.
majority of people that are involved in extremism don't commit violent acts. And that's why the FBI doesn't look at groups. They look at individual actions as acts of domestic extremism.
And since '95, it seems to me in 2001. I mean, up till 2001, suddenly from '95 to 2001, there was a more intense investigations of domestic groups or extremist groups, and then came September 11th, and so it seemed to shift like radically. Suddenly, it was all international terrorism and all that, and so now we could get to today where we see some of the militias out there, and you say that they've shifted from being anti-government to pro-government. Do they have any connection? Did the militias sort of die out and sort of was there a resurgence of a new wave of militia, or was there some continuity
I think
to?
some follow over from the old school, but events as things kind of slowed down in the domestic mindset, and there were a lot of things that made that happen. Right, when I was working the domestic extremists during when President Obama was elected, I honestly felt that we were going to see an uptick in white power, white nationalists,
Right.
because there is now the first African American president. And really, the opposite kind of happened. People in that belief went underground
Mhm.
That doesn't mean they went away. It
Right.
meant that they weren't out doing as much publicly,
Right.
because I
And
think
why? Why do you think that was?
I think they honestly felt that they would be looked at more under an administration that was cognizant of that. And that it didn't really happen the way I thought it was going to. But once we got beyond that, and there were some of these groups feel like they have a common bond with the current administration. I'm not saying they do or they don't, but I know for a fact that words matter, and sometimes when things are said, not just by the person in charge, but by people following, that these people feel like they have a support network.
Sure.
And I'm not going to get into the politics of that, but
Mhm.
it is clear that some of the people in the less active or less violent groups felt like in the beginning of this that they had support, and for the first time I had seen where the extremists actually had more of a political side to them instead of an anti political. And prior to what we're seeing now, we had groups of individuals that were very strong against any form of government, and both on the left and the right, and that was kind of their play. Now,
Do you see now a different with Trump? I mean, some people on the left say, "Oh, Trump has sort of stirred up this sentiment again that he's encouraging this sort of hate." Is that a fair criticism, or do you see any difference with
yeah,
Trump?
to be honest, and I would have, I'm trying to be as nonpartisan as I can in
Right,
any of
right.
these talks, but there is definitely, and whether it is true or not, it doesn't matter. It's the belief of the people who are hearing things, uh,
Mhm.
and then you throw into the mix now, and I think one of the most important things is that back in the '90s, early 2000, um, we didn't have the ability to communicate as we do today.
Mhm.
So when you were working these groups in Michigan, the only way that they could get the word out for a rally or an event was by word of mouth, by phone, and then it became like the big deal. They had chat rooms on internet, right? The internet was this great communication tool. You take that to today, and I think the perfect example of that is Charlottesville. The
Mhm.
night before the actual main event in Charlottesville, there was an scheduled event, scheduled being that it wasn't permitted, uh,
Mhm.
event at the University of Virginia, and close to 1,000 people showed up carrying torches
Right.
and
Wow.
marching through the UVA campus, chanting "Jews will not replace us" and "Fire up the ovens, boys." Now that doesn't just happen, right? I mean,
Right.
the ability to muster that many people together
Mhm.
is done through social media. So social media has made a huge influence in the ability for people to communicate in their cause.
Mhm.
And if you then throw into it uh, the conspiracy theories that are really running amok across the country right now, I just heard one the other day that the left is responsible for the fires out west. I mean, let's be a little bit realistic here. But people believe this stuff, and they click on their whatever their social media is, and they don't have any real background in belief or that this any way of confirming it, but they automatically forward it. And then that gets forwarded and gets forwarded, and it doesn't take much for something to become a fact. So
Mhm.
if you don't really review the facts that are coming in, then you're part of the problem. You're pushing out this narrative that is likely to be false, and I think we've seen that. And then you have to throw in the potential for foreign actors to
Mhm.
be involved in spreading that disinformation, because you know to disrupt the United States government in our social fabric, the only way to really do that is from within.
Mhm.
And right now, I think we're about as disrupted as we have been in my lifetime. So it's a confusing time for people, and unfortunately, it's become
A scary time, I think, for a lot of people. Let me ask you, the first time that I actually saw you, it was, I think it was 2005, and the white supremacist groups were doing a demonstration in front of the Israeli embassy in Northwest DC,
right.
and there were a lot of guys with skinheads marching around and doing the Zig Heils and all that. And I remember it was funny. Afterwards, I was at a retirement party at the Washington Field office, and I said, "You look familiar." I said, "Were you at the rally?" And you were undercover with
Hopefully undercover, right? Yeah, that's
with all these skinheads,
yeah.
and we're all doing the Zig Heils and all that. And so the question I have is, and I know later that night there was some type of like white supremacist concert in Baltimore or something.
Right.
And so the question is, obviously, you guys were keeping track. How well does the FBI know all the groups out there and keep track of them? And how easy is it to infiltrate
So
these
that's
groups?
a great question, Alan, because it leads into a lot of discussion, right? The FBI is not mandated with. They're not the thought police, right? So if you have some thought, you hate this one or you hate that one, the FBI shouldn't have anything to do with that. That's First Amendment protected. You and I may not like it. The person over there may not like it, but there are people that do agree with them, right? So groups themselves in the United States are not designated as terrorist organizations. The Ku Klux Klan, take the big ones that people think about. People marching down the street with a robe and a torch and that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's still not illegal. It's not illegal to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. I can't tell you how many times I got calls from people and saying, "Hey, my neighbor's a member of the Ku Klux Klan or whatever it is."
Right.
You know what? That's unfortunate. It's that you live next door to this guy, but it's not illegal.
Right.
The only thing that the FBI and federal law enforcement can look at is like acts, criminal acts or potential criminal acts, violent. It has to meet standards, very, very stringent standards for someone to look at. So for an agent to be at an event like the one in 2005, we have to have targets that we are already investigating to bring us there, because that rally and that event, that's all First Amendment protected, and the FBI nor law enforcement intelligence can't have anything to do with that. Police can be there to make sure it's safe and keep this group away from that group so that they don't fight. But the intelligence portion of it, the act of following up on this terrorist stuff, it can only be done if there is an individual who there's an open case on. And it takes it, and people don't understand that it's not just as easy as, hey, the guy's a member of an extremist group, he's Antifa, or he's this. Antifa is not a terrorist organization. It actually isn't even an organization. It's a movement. Much like the Boogaloo Boys is not a group with like the old William Pierce, who was at the Alliance. That was an actual group. These are now more ideological movements. And from that, you're going to find extremists who will be willing and feel like they're the only ones who are up to the cause and will take it to violence, because everything else is talking, and that's where your problem comes in.
And in terms of publicity of these groups, some seem to want the publicity. I remember talking during the rally over in front of the Israeli embassy. I was talking to the head of the white supremacist group from West Virginia, and I was saying, "Well, how's it going today?" Yeah, and he's like, "Yeah, pretty good." He says, "I think we're getting a lot of good publicity here. We got a lot of media coverage and stuff." How important is it for these groups?
Well, I'll tell you what. At that event, the best thing that happened to that individual was that he had hit in the head with a skateboard.
Oh, really?
It was caught on camera. I'm not saying it was a good thing that he got hit in the head, but for their cause, it was good, because the reason that those guys march in front of the Israeli embassy is because they want the counter protesters to break bad, to do the things that will happen, because the anarchists on the left have it's almost like oil and water. Where you have a neo-Nazi organization, you're going to have Antifa, which is the anti-fascist movement. They're there to fight the fascist neo-Nazis.
Right.
And when that guy was hit in the head with a skateboard, he was able to go on camera. He didn't wipe the blood off his face. He just kept it there, and when got interviewed, and everybody's like, "Oh, look at this guy. He got hit in the head by these guys over here." The other. So now I'm going to go join that group because I don't think that should have happened. He's only doing his First Amendment protected activity of speech.
Right.
So it actually is a recruitment tool for them to see themselves be victimized by the opposite side. And it comes down to all these groups, both on all political sides, feel they're victims, and they feel that they need to fight against whatever the opposite side is. And right now, being completely polarized left and right, you're going to have both sides of this coin willing to step out and commit violent acts against their perceived adversary.
Okay. Now, there's some groups outside of law enforcement that you guys do work with, the ADL.
Sure.
That keeps track, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I was looking at some of the lists of, and tell me if these, in Michigan, the Southern Poverty Law Center lists some of the hate groups as the Daily Stormers, Proud Boys, Sharia Crime Stoppers. And some of the groups are just hate everybody. Some are anti-Black and Jew, and some are, specifically anti-Muslim. Are these groups that you were familiar with it? And the KKK, I guess, is still operating to some degree in Michigan here. Was Michigan, like, did it pop off the map for you during all your years of working?
It didn't. I was working in the Washington field office and predominantly worked the DC region, Virginia and this area. But through working with informants and sources, would go nationally quite often with cases. So I don't think militia or Michigan, besides having that very famous Michigan militia, that which draws it back. I think right now the country has a problem across the board. Groups like ADL and Southern Poverty do great work. There are standards for what a group is or what an act is. They're not under the restrictions that, say, the federal government is, in that there is a definition of domestic terrorism. There is no penalty for committing an act of domestic terrorism, which is something that I have been trying to get the word out quite a bit over the years. Is that if you had, like, use Charlottesville as an example, when a car was driven into a crowd and Heather Heyer, one of the protesters, was killed, and about 19 people were seriously injured. The driver of that car was never charged with domestic terrorism. If that was a person who aspired to Al Qaeda or ISIS, they would be charged with an act of terrorism. But because we don't have terrorist groups in the United States, it's different. So the act itself has to meet the definition of domestic terrorism. But when you go to actually charge somebody with domestic terrorism, there is no penalty under 2331.
And you've been pushing. You've been somebody advocating that for a long time.
Yeah, I have been, because if you rob a bank, you're charged with bank robbery, right? If you commit an act which meets the definition of domestic terrorism, whether you're on the right or you're on the left, it doesn't matter. This is as bipartisan a topic as there possibly can be. It's the criminal act committing this violent in the idea of a movement. You're not just doing it. It's politics, or it's to forward your movement. And if you commit that act, you should be able to be charged with terrorism. The person is still going to be charged with firearms violations, the assaults, other things, maybe through the state level or through the federal level, but they're never going to be charged unless they use a weapon of mass destruction, a bomb. That's very rare, the circumstances, and that was built off the McVeigh bombing in '95. But
where do you see this all going with all the guns showing up everywhere? Is it going to get worse after the election, or is it going to calm down, or is it depend on who gets elected, or where do you see it?
Yeah, so I don't see it getting better before it gets worse. I think unfortunately, no matter who is elected, the opposite side has a strong enough radical base right now that there will be a action to the reaction to the action of a person being elected. And we know that somebody's got to be elected, right? So,
Right.
one side or the other is likely to have people who are willing to step outside the legal bounds of protest and,
Mhm.
do an act which actually fulfills the definition of domestic terrorism. And I hope I'm wrong, but I don't. The tenor that we're seeing right now shows that I don't think I'm going to be proven wrong.
Not, not off. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out.
No, it's always good to talk to Alan. It's been
Yeah, likewise.
you're the first person I ever gave an interview to with sanction from the FBI, obviously, to discuss the white nationalists and domestic extremists coming from that side of the shop. So
Right. Well, I appreciate that, and it's great to see you again.
that's good, and I hope we don't run into each other at a rally.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Those
Okay.
days
Well,
are done.
yeah. All right. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time out.